with Mr. Warford. Updates with Mr. Warford. Updates with Mr. Warford. Updates with Mr. Warford.
What's up? Welcome to Updates with Mr. Warford. This is for my AP Human Geography people today. So last week in our Unit 4, we talked about different types of boundaries. All right, and here is a comprehensive list of the different types of boundaries. This slideshow will be available to you as well, so you can go back and study. But we talked about different types of boundaries last week. Some other things that we talked about last week were how do you define political entities in political geography, and there's states, nation states, autonomous regions, all the different definitions that we did that graphic organizer about. And here are some examples that we talked about from last week. Examples of nation states, Japan and Iceland. Example of a state we talked about was the United States. Multinational states like Canada, the former Soviet Union. And then we talked in depth about Kurdistan with that assignment about Kurdistan. We talked previously in this class about Palestine. It's an example of a stateless nation, as well as the Basque region. So remember that the tricky part for the AP exam is that if you're going to label something or ID something as a state, stateless nation, autonomous region, whatever it may be, make sure you stick to APHG examples from the textbook. Because if you Google these, you're going to find different answers and some may be incorrect. So if you're going to name drop or give an example in an FRQ and you're saying this is a state, this is a nation state, make sure you're using examples from our class with the AP text. Today's focus is how are boundaries made and what are the types of boundary disputes or conflicts. Remember to keep in mind that AP Human Geography is not a history class, okay? We're covering a lot of examples in Unit 4 that will be useful for you, but know the background, but also be able to apply the human geography concept. So we're going to be talking in depth about the Berlin Wall today, for example. So if you can talk about the Berlin Wall and write 10 pages on the Berlin Wall, that's great, but if you can't relate it to the AP Human Geography concepts, it really doesn't serve a good purpose for you for the AP exam. So make sure that you know the background, but make sure that you can also connect it to an AP Human Geography concept. So first off is how are boundaries made? Okay, the first way that a boundary is made is by defining it. Okay, this is established by a legal document such as a treaty, an agreement between two countries. It divides one entity from another with an invisible line. The next up is delimiting. So a line drawn on a map to show the limits of a space. So how far can you go in one direction or another? An example is any political map. The next is demarcating. All right, physical objects actually placed on the landscape to tell you this is the beginning of this and this is the end of this. Okay, so here's an example of a demarcated boundary is Israel's West Bank, as we've talked about earlier this year, the tension between Israel and Palestine, and in some places around Israel there are actual physical walls that demarcate a boundary. So it's human nature that when these political entities want to section off pieces of land in different regions that people are going to dispute those. What are the types of disputes that you need to know for your test? One of them is definitional. So how do we define a legal document? There may be some friction or conflict about a legal document. So an example of that would be the countries of Chile and Argentina. The Andes Mountains work as kind of a buffer between them. And in their legal documentation about their borders, it talks about how the mountains are a buffer between them. But there has been conflict or disagreement about exactly where that line is, that invisible border, because it's hard to know exactly when you're talking about on top of a giant mountain range. So that's a definitional dispute. Next is operational. And this is the example that we're going to get into more depth today with an assignment about the Berlin Wall. But operational disputes are revolving around how the boundary functions. So when the Berlin Wall existed, after World War II, Germany was split into East and West. All right, East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. West Germany was controlled by Britain, the United States, and France. So the problem arose when West Germany kind of viewed the boundary as kind of more fluid. They weren't guarding it as heavily, this boundary between East and West. The Soviets were guarding that boundary very heavily and telling people that they couldn't go into West Germany. So when you have two entities that disagree on how strict this boundary needs to be, that's an operational dispute. Next up is locational. So exactly where should a boundary be located? An example of that would be after World War I, Poland and Germany were in a dispute about who should get land after World War I. So this chunk of land from Germany was given to Poland. France was given some land. Denmark was given some land, and they had to disagree, argue, fight over how big that chunk was after Germany lost in World War I. Next up is allocational. Okay, who has claims to natural resources? All right. So when you have natural resources, obviously different political entities, countries want access to as much as they can to help people in their country. But sometimes these invisible borders on a political map can overlap where natural resources are. So an example would be Iraq and Kuwait. If you look at our boundary between Iraq and Kuwait, this giant red blob is an oil field, and you'll see that it overlaps over this boundary. So there have been disputes over who gets to own this oil field, because as you see, the vast majority of the oil field belongs in Iraq and then a small amount in Kuwait. So who gets claims to that oil? Who gets to take that oil out of the ground? That's an allocational dispute. So the case study we're going to look at today is the Berlin Wall. All right, you're going to complete an assignment that's titled Boundary Disputes, the Berlin Wall in Google Classroom, and I want you to be able to complete that today because we need to make up some time in Unit 4 to cover all the information that we need to so that you can be successful on your test. So if you have any questions for me, let me know. Look in Google Classroom for your stuff. Have a great day.